I remember the exact moment when my world began its slow descent into darkness. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where golden leaves dance on the sidewalk and the air carries the promise of change. Sarah and I were celebrating our 5th wedding anniversary at our favorite cafe, the same place where we had our first date. The sunlight streaming through the window caught her dark hair, creating a halo effect that made her look almost ethereal. If only I had known then how that heavenly image would later haunt me. "Do you ever think about having kids?" she asked, stirring her cappuccino with unusual intensity. Her eyes held a sparkle I hadn't seen before, and something else. Nervousness, perhaps? The question didn't surprise me. We had discussed children before, always in that comfortable, theoretical way couples do when the future stretches endlessly before them. But this time felt different. There was an urgency in her voice that made my heart skip a beat. "Of course," I replied, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I've always imagined a little version of us running around the house, causing chaos." I smiled, picturing a child with Sarah's infectious laugh and my stubborn determination. That conversation set everything in motion. The following months were a whirlwind of hope and disappointment, tracking cycles and temperature charts, and transforming our intimate moments into calculated attempts at conception. Sarah approached it with an almost obsessive determination that both impressed and slightly worried me. But I understood. We both wanted this so badly. When she finally burst into our bedroom one morning, pregnancy test in hand, tears of joy streaming down her face, I felt like the luckiest man alive. We celebrated that night with sparkling cider, no more wine for Sarah, making plans and choosing names. The way she glowed with happiness made every struggle worth it. The pregnancy was textbook perfect. Sarah bloomed like a flower in spring, and I found myself falling in love with her all over again. I attended every doctor's appointment, recorded every ultrasound, and spent countless nights talking to her growing belly. We painted the nursery a soft sage green, filled it with stuffed animals, and created a peaceful sanctuary for our future child. During those months, our bond seemed stronger than ever. Sarah would often catch me staring at her in wonder, and we'd share knowing smiles, feeling like we were part of some beautiful secret. We took long walks in the park, her hand protectively cradling her bump, while we discussed our hopes and dreams for our child's future. Little did I know that this period of pure joy was merely the calm before the storm. Looking back now, I see subtle signs I missed. Moments when Sarah's smile didn't quite reach her eyes, phone conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room, and strange expressions that flitted across her face when we discussed genetic traits our baby might inherit. But in those early days, wrapped in the warm cocoon of impending parenthood, I was blind to anything but our happiness. The thought that this beautiful chapter of our lives would lead to the unraveling of everything I believed in had never crossed my mind. How could it? When you're living in a dream, you don't expect to wake up to a nightmare. The day our son was born started with a storm. Thunder rolled across the sky as Sarah gripped my hand, her face contorted in pain. The delivery room buzzed with controlled chaos, machines beeping in rhythm with her labored breathing. I remember thinking how fitting it was. New life entering the world amid nature's dramatic display. Hours blurred together in a haze of encouragement and anticipation. When the first cry pierced the air, my heart swelled with an emotion I couldn't name. The nurse placed him in Sarah's arms, and I leaned in, eager to memorize every detail of our son's face. That's when I first noticed it, a tuft of bright blonde hair, catching the harsh hospital lights like spun gold. Something shifted in my chest, a barely perceptible click like a lock turning. I pushed the thought away, focusing instead on Sarah's radiant smile as she cradled our newborn. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, "He's perfect, isn't he?" I nodded, swallowing past the sudden tightness in my throat. The next few weeks passed in a sleep-deprived blur. Our home transformed into a sanctuary of baby sounds, soft coos, midnight cries, the gentle whir of the mobile above the crib. I threw myself into fatherhood with desperate enthusiasm, changing diapers, preparing bottles, walking the floors at 3 a.m. with our son against my shoulder. Each moment felt precious, yet somehow tainted by an underlying current of unease I couldn't shake. Family visited, bearing gifts and congratulations. My mother cooed over the baby, but I caught the slight furrow of her brow as she studied his features. "He's unique," she said carefully, her eyes meeting mine with an unspoken question. Sarah quickly jumped in, launching into a story about her gray-tans blonde children, her voice carrying a hint of defensiveness I hadn't noticed before. Late at night, while Sarah slept, I would stand over the crib, watching our son's chest rise and fall. His blonde hair seemed to glow in the dim light of the nursery, a beacon drawing my attention again and again. I found myself studying his face with increasing intensity, searching for traces of myself in his delicate features. Sometimes, in these quiet moments, doubt would creep in like a shadow, only to be chased away by waves of guilt and shame. How could I question this miracle? How could I taint this joy with suspicion? Sarah seemed to sense my internal struggle. She became increasingly effusive in pointing out similarities between me and the baby. "Look at his chin. It's exactly like yours," she would exclaim. Or, "He has your expressions when he's thinking hard." Each comparison felt like a band-aid over a growing wound, temporary reassurance that didn't quite stick. I started spending hours scrolling through old family photos, tracing genetic lines back through generations. Dark hair dominated both sides of my family tree, rich browns and deep blacks, but not a single strand of blonde. Sarah's family albums showed the same pattern. When I mentioned this to her, she laughed it off, tossing around terms like recessive genes and genetic surprises with practiced ease. As our son grew, so did the whispers. At the grocery store, at family gatherings, at the park, people would comment on his striking blonde hair, their eyes darting between Sarah and me with poorly concealed curiosity. Each remark felt like a tiny needle, pricking at the bubble of happiness I desperately tried to maintain. I loved our son, fiercely, completely, unconditionally. But with each passing day, that love began to intertwine with a growing sense of unease, like roots wrapping around a stone buried deep in the earth. Questions I didn't want to ask began taking shape in the corners of my mind, casting long shadows over our perfect family picture. As summer faded into autumn, I found myself cataloging moments like precious artifacts, each one carrying the weight of unspoken questions. Our son was growing faster than I could comprehend, his blonde hair catching sunlight in ways that made my chest tighten. Sarah had developed a habit of photographing us together, almost compulsively, as if trying to document proof of something I couldn't quite grasp. One evening, while giving him a bath, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror alongside his. The contrast was stark, my dark hair against his fair locks, like night and day existing in the same frame. Something about that image lodged itself in my throat, a persistent ache that wouldn't fade. Sarah found us there, me lost in thought while our son splashed happily in the water. The look that passed across her face was fleeting but unmistakable. Fear, or perhaps guilt, quickly masked by a too bright smile. "He has your laugh," she said, wrapping her arms around my waist from behind. The words felt rehearsed, part of a script she'd been perfecting. I nodded, unable to speak past the knot in my throat. Our son giggled, sending water cascading over the tub's edge, and Sarah rushed to grab towels, grateful for the distraction. The nights became my enemy. While Sarah slept peacefully beside me, I would lie awake, my mind spinning through countless scenarios and possibilities. I started noticing things I'd overlooked before, how she always answered certain phone calls in another room, the way she'd grown protective of her phone, password changing it regularly. Small things, perhaps meaningless on their own, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't unsee. At work, I found myself distracted, staring at family photos on my desk until they blurred into abstract shapes. My colleagues noticed the change in me, though they attributed it to new parent exhaustion. If only that were all it was. During lunch breaks, I began researching genetics, reading scientific articles about inheritance patterns until my eyes burned. The more I learned, the more questions arose. each one heavier than the last. Sarah's behavior shifted too, though so subtly that at first I thought I was imagining it. She became more attentive, almost desperately so, planning family outings and creating photo opportunities at every turn. Each weekend brought a new activity: trips to the park, visits to the zoo, family portraits of them all. She documented everything, filling our social media with carefully curated moments of domestic bliss. Looking back, I realized she was building a fortress of evidence, brick by brick. The breaking point came during a routine dinner with my parents. My mother, always observant, watched our son playing on the living room floor. "He's getting so big," she mused, then added carefully. "He reminds me of someone, but I can't quite place it." Sarah's fork clattered against her plate, the sound sharp in the sudden silence. Her recovery was quick: a laugh, a deflection, a rapid change of subject, but the moment hung in the air like smoke. That night, after we returned home, I found Sarah in our son's room, watching him sleep. Tears traced silent paths down her cheeks, but when I asked what was wrong, she blamed it on hormones, on motherhood's overwhelming emotions. I wanted to believe her. God, how I wanted to believe her. But as I held her, feeling her shoulders shake with silent sobs, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was mourning something I didn't yet understand. In quiet moments, when I held our son, my love for him felt like a physical ache in my chest. His innocent eyes held no knowledge of the turmoil brewing beneath our household's calm surface. He would reach for me with complete trust, his small hands patting my face, and in those moments, DNA didn't matter. He was my son in every way that counted. Yet the questions remained, growing like shadows as the sun sets, impossible to ignore. I began keeping a journal, documenting my observations and thoughts, though I hated myself for doing it. Each entry felt like a betrayal of the life we'd built, but I couldn't stop. The weight of uncertainty was crushing me, transforming me into someone I barely recognized in the mirror. Sarah must have sensed the change in me, because her efforts to maintain our perfect family facade intensified, becoming almost frantic in their desperation. Winter descended like a shroud over our home, bringing with it long nights that seemed to mirror the darkness growing in my mind. The holidays approached, and with them came the inevitable parade of family gatherings, each one feeling more like a performance than a celebration. I watched Sarah navigate these events with practiced grace, but beneath her carefully constructed smile, I sensed a growing tension, like a violin string pulled too tight, ready to snap. One evening, while organizing old photographs for a family album Sarah insisted we needed, I found myself lingering over our wedding pictures. There we were, frozen in time, our faces glowing with the certainty of young love. Sarah's dark hair cascaded down her back, her eyes holding mine with what I had once believed was absolute truth. Now, looking at those same photos, I searched for signs I might have missed, little tells that could have warned me of the doubts that would eventually consume our lives. The sound of her laughter drifted up from downstairs, where she was playing with our son. The joy in it seemed genuine, but lately everything about Sarah felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. I'd catch her watching me when she thought I wasn't looking, her expression a complex mixture of love and something else, something that made my stomach twist with unease. During our son's first Christmas, the cracks in our facade began to show more clearly. My sister, visiting from out of state, innocently commented on his hair while helping decorate the tree. "It's getting even lighter," she observed, ornament suspended midair. "Like white gold." Sarah's response was immediate, a well-rehearsed story about genetic diversity. But her hands shook as she arranged presents under the tree, and she excused herself shortly after, claiming a headache. That night, I found myself standing in our son's room again, watching him sleep peacefully in his crib. The moonlight filtering through the window cast strange shadows on the walls. And for a moment, everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life play out before me. He stirred in his sleep, one tiny hand reaching out, and my heart constricted with a love so fierce it bordered on pain. How could something that felt so real be built on such uncertain ground? Sarah's behavior grew increasingly erratic as winter deepened. She began organizing and reorganizing our son's baby photos obsessively, creating elaborate digital albums with detailed captions about his similarities to me. When I walked into rooms, conversations on her phone would end abruptly. Her smile became brittle, cracking at the edges when she thought no one was watching. One particularly cold morning, while getting our son dressed, I noticed a small birthmark behind his ear, something I'd somehow missed before. It was shaped like a crescent moon, delicate and pale against his skin. That evening, I casually mentioned it to Sarah, watching her reaction carefully. The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. She recovered quickly, but that moment lodged itself in my memory like a splinter. The weight of unasked questions began affecting our intimacy. Nights that were once filled with warm embraces and soft conversations became exercises in careful distance. We moved around each other like dancers following different rhythms, our touches perfunctory, our words measured. Sarah tried to bridge the growing gap with grand gestures, surprise dinners, thoughtful gifts, endless photos of father-son moments. But each attempt felt somehow hollow, like applying bandages to a wound that went bone deep. I started having dreams, vivid, unsettling visions where I was searching through endless rooms in our house, looking for something I couldn't name. In each room, I would find photographs of our family, but in every image, my face was blurred, unrecognizable. I would wake from these dreams covered in cold sweat, Sarah's sleeping form beside me suddenly feeling like a stranger's. The trust that had once been the bedrock of our relationship was eroding, swept away by a tide of doubt that grew stronger with each passing day. Yet I remained silent, trapped in a prison of my own making, afraid that speaking my fears aloud would make them real. Meanwhile, our son continued to grow, his innocent laughter a reminder of everything I stood to lose if my suspicions proved true. Spring arrived with a cruel irony, the world outside bursting with new life, while something within our home was slowly dying. I found myself watching Sarah's reflection in windows and mirrors, studying her when she wasn't aware, as if her image might reveal truths her words concealed. The woman I'd married seemed to flicker in and out of focus, like a channel losing reception, replaced by someone I barely recognized. It happened during an ordinary moment, those seconds that change everything always do. I was sorting through old mail in our home office when I found it, a crumpled receipt that had fallen behind the desk. A coffee shop downtown, dated 9 months before our son was conceived. The timestamp read 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday when Sarah had told me she was in meetings all afternoon. Such a small thing, this piece of paper, yet it felt heavy as lead in my hands. That night, I lay awake watching the ceiling fan cast spinning shadows, each rotation seeming to mock the cyclical nature of my thoughts. Sarah's breathing beside me was steady, peaceful. How could she sleep so soundly while carrying whatever truth she held? I remembered all the Tuesday afternoons that followed that coffee shop receipt, wondering how many other meetings weren't meetings at all. Our son's first words came during this time, that falling from his lips like a bittersweet gift. Sarah filmed it, of course, her hands trembling slightly as she held the phone. I watched her face in that moment, saw something crack beneath her smile when I gathered him in my arms, pride and love warring with an ache I couldn't name. That video joined countless others in her carefully curated collection of our family life, each one feeling increasingly like evidence in a case I didn't want to prove. The questions I couldn't ask began manifesting in strange ways. I developed insomnia, spending hours tracing the paths of my thoughts like a detective following leads that led nowhere. Work suffered, my focus scattered, my mind constantly drawn back to that coffee shop receipt, to Tuesday afternoons, to blonde hair and crescent moon birthmarks. My boss noticed, suggested I take some time off to recharge. The irony wasn't lost on me. More time at home, where every moment felt like walking through a minefield of unspoken truths. Sarah's attempts to maintain normalcy took on an almost frantic quality. She planned a family photo session, insisting on coordinating outfits, all of us in blue, to bring out the similarities in your eyes, she said. The photographer positioned us carefully, adjusting angles and expressions. Looking at the final images, I saw what Sarah wanted everyone to see: a perfect family unit, bound by love and genetics. But I also saw what she was trying to hide, the subtle differences that no amount of coordinated clothing could disguise. During our son's regular checkup, the pediatrician casually mentioned blood types while updating his medical records. A simple question, "And the father's blood type?" sent Sarah into a flurry of activity, suddenly remembering an urgent phone call she had to make. I sat there, holding our son, as a new piece of the puzzle clicked into place with devastating potential. The walls of our home began to feel like they were closing in, every room haunted by memories I could no longer trust. Photos that once brought joy now seemed to mock me from their frames. Even our son's laughter, pure and innocent, carried undertones of questions I couldn't silence. Sarah must have felt it too, the tension building like a storm about to break. She became more desperate in her efforts to prove our family's authenticity, as if she could make something true simply by believing in it hard enough. At night, when the house settled into silence, I would sometimes hear her crying in our son's room. Standing in the darkness of the hallway, listening to her muffled sobs, I felt torn between compassion and anger. What right did she have to cry? What secrets warranted these midnight vigils in our son's room? But beneath these questions lay a deeper fear, that the answers would destroy not just my marriage, but the very foundation of the life I'd built my heart around. Memory plays cruel tricks when trust begins to fade. Sitting in my car outside our house one evening, I found myself replaying moments from years ago, before our son, before the doubts began their slow poison. Each memory now felt tainted, like old photographs suffering water damage, the edges bleeding into uncertainty. Had Sarah's touch always carried that hint of guilt? Had her eyes always darted away during certain conversations? Or was I reconstructing the past through the lens of present suspicion? The garage door was open, spilling warm light into the gathering dusk. Through the window, I could see Sarah moving around the kitchen, our son balanced on her hip as she prepared dinner. Such an ordinary scene, one I'd witnessed countless times before. Yet tonight, it felt like watching actors on a stage, performing a life I once believed was authentically mine. Earlier that day, I'd run into an old friend from college who worked at the hospital where Sarah claimed she'd had all her prenatal appointments. The conversation started casually enough, but when I mentioned Sarah's name, something flickered across my friend's face. Confusion, then recognition, but not the kind that matched our story. "Sarah, your wife?" I don't remember seeing her charts come through during that time. She caught herself quickly, backtracking with practiced medical discretion, but the damage was done. That evening, watching Sarah through the window, I noticed how she kept checking her phone, the blue light illuminating her face in quick bursts. Our son reached for something on the counter, and she adjusted him automatically, her movements those of a loving mother. The sight made my chest ache. How could something so genuine exist alongside whatever secret she was keeping? Inside, dinner played out like a carefully choreographed dance. Sarah chatted about her day, filling the silence with stories about our son's latest achievements. "He stacked blocks just like you used to," she said, her voice carrying that slight edge of desperation I'd begun to recognize. "Remember how you told me about building towers as a kid?" I nodded, wondering if she realized how transparent these constant comparisons had become. After putting our son to bed, Sarah suggested watching old home videos, another of her recent fixations. The footage showed holidays, birthdays, ordinary moments she'd captured with almost obsessive dedication. I watched myself on screen, playing with our son, my love for him radiating from every frame. Sarah's voice provided constant commentary from behind the camera, always pointing out similarities, always building her case. Late that night, I found myself in our home office again, the room that had yielded the coffee shop receipt. My hands moved through drawers with purpose now, though I wasn't sure what I was looking for. In the bottom drawer of Sarah's desk, beneath a stack of insurance papers, I found a small box. Inside were hospital bracelets, but not from the hospital where my friend worked. The dates aligned perfectly with our son's birth. The discovery sent me into a spiral of memories. Sarah's insistence on using a hospital across town, claiming their maternity ward had better reviews. The way she'd been adamant about handling all the paperwork herself. How she discouraged my mother from visiting during the first few days, citing hospital policies that I now realized might not have existed. Standing there in the dark office, holding those hospital bracelets, I felt something shift inside me, like tectonic plates grinding beneath the surface of my carefully constructed world. The evidence was mounting, each piece fitting together with horrible precision, yet I still couldn't bring myself to confront the full picture they formed. Through the wall, I could hear Sarah's soft footsteps in our son's room, her nightly ritual of checking on him, perhaps standing guard over her secrets. I returned the box exactly as I'd found it, but its discovery left an invisible mark on my soul. That night, lying beside Sarah in our bed, the space between us felt infinite, though we were separated by mere inches. Her breathing carried the weight of unspoken truths, while mine held the burden of questions I was becoming increasingly afraid to ask. A dropped phone can change everything. It happened on a Sunday morning, one of those peaceful moments when life seems deceptively normal. Sarah was making pancakes, our son playing with his blocks on the kitchen floor. Her phone slipped from the counter, landing face up, screen unlocked. I reached to pick it up, and that's when I saw it. A message notification from someone named Mark with a fragment of text visible. "He looks more like you every..." The world tilted on its axis. Sarah snatched the phone away with unusual speed, her face cycling through emotions too quickly to read. "Just a work colleague," she said, but her voice carried a tremor I'd never heard before. Our son looked up at the sudden tension, his blonde curls catching the morning light, and my heart contracted painfully in my chest. That night, after our son was asleep, I sat in my car in the garage, hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The pieces were there, had been there all along. The hospital bracelets from the wrong hospital, the coffee shop receipt, the blood type question, and now this message. Each one a thread in a tapestry of deception I was only beginning to understand. Sarah's behavior shifted dramatically in the days that followed. She became almost manic in her efforts to create perfect family moments, scheduling a professional photo shoot, planning elaborate weekend outings, documenting everything with an intensity that bordered on obsession. But beneath her forced cheerfulness, I caught glimpses of raw fear in her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. During a family dinner at her parents' house, I noticed something that had somehow escaped my attention before. On their mantel stood a collection of family photos, including one of Sarah in her college years. She was standing next to a tall, blonde man, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. When she saw me studying the photo, she quickly steered me away, launching into a story about our son's latest developmental milestone. That photo haunted me. Later that night, I found myself deep in Sarah's social media history, scrolling back through years of posts. The man from the photo appeared several times in older pictures, always tagged as Mark Thompson. The dates of these posts stopped abruptly around the time we started trying for a baby. Sleep became impossible. I lay awake watching Sarah's face in the soft darkness, wondering how many lies had passed through those lips I'd once trusted completely. During the day, I went through the motions of normalcy while my mind worked overtime, connecting dots I'd previously refused to see. The timeline of her business trips during our attempts to conceive, the mysterious hospital choice, the blonde hair that matched neither of our genetics but bore a striking resemblance to the man in that old photograph. Our son continued to be the eye of this emotional storm, his innocent love anchor in my increasingly chaotic world. One evening, as I read him his bedtime story, he reached up to touch my face, his small fingers tracing my features with complete trust. The gesture nearly broke me. Genetics or not, the bond between us was real, forged through countless moments of love and care. Yet the question of his true parentage now loomed like a shadow over every interaction. Sarah must have sensed the walls closing in. She began leaving her laptop open to photos of us, strategically placed family albums appearing around the house like evidence in a case she was desperately trying to prove. Her touches became more frequent, but carried an edge of panic, as if she could hold our crumbling reality together through sheer force of will. One night, I found her in our son's room again, crying silently as she watched him sleep. When she noticed me in the doorway, she quickly wiped her eyes and whispered, "He loves you so much." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken truths. I wanted to respond, to demand answers, but the sight of our son's peaceful face held me back. Not yet, not here, but soon. The weight of unasked questions would become unbearable. The truth revealed itself on an ordinary Wednesday evening, the kind where life changes irrevocably in the space between heartbeats. Our son was at my parents' house for his weekly sleepover, leaving the house eerily quiet. I sat in our darkened home office, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating a trail of digital breadcrumbs I'd been following for weeks. A forgotten password, an old email account of Sarah's still logged in on our shared computer. Such small things to destroy a life built on years of trust. The emails stretched back years, an archive of deception that made my hands tremble as I scrolled. There he was, Mark Thompson, the blonde man from the photographs. The secret that Sarah had buried beneath layers of careful lies. Their correspondence told a story that turned my world to ashes. Regular meetings at that downtown coffee shop. Plans carefully orchestrated around my business trips. Medical discussions about fertility and timing that matched precisely with our son's conception. Each revelation felt like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. When Sarah came home from her evening yoga class, she found me sitting in the kitchen, printouts of emails spread across the table like tarot cards revealing a dark future. The moment she saw them, all pretense fell away. Her yoga bag slipped from nerveless fingers, hitting the floor with a thud that echoed in the sudden silence. "How long have you known?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I think part of me has always known," I replied, my own voice sounding strange to my ears. "But I didn't want to see it. Tell me about Mark." The truth spilled from her like a dam breaking. Mark, her college sweetheart, the one who got away. They'd reconnected through social media during our fertility struggles. What started as innocent catching up evolved into something more. When we couldn't conceive, she turned to him, desperate for the child she feared she'd never have. "I never meant to hurt you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You have to believe that. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought I could make it work. I convinced myself that love would be enough, that biology wouldn't matter. You let me believe he was mine," I said, each word carrying the weight of betrayal. "You watched me fall in love with him, knowing the truth all along. You constructed this elaborate lie, day by day, moment by moment. Because he is yours," she cried desperately. "In every way that matters. I've seen how you love him, how he loves you. DNA doesn't make a father." "Stop." The word cut through her justifications like a blade. "You don't get to decide that. You took away my choice. Every smile, every moment of joy. You tainted all of it with your lies." The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed, marking seconds that felt like years. Outside, a car alarm wailed briefly, then fell silent. Inside, years of deception hung heavy in the air between us. "Is he still in the picture?" I asked finally. Her silence was answer enough. The mysterious phone messages, the careful deletions of texts, it all made horrifying sense now. "He has a right to know his son," she whispered. "His son." The words felt like poison on my tongue. "And what about me? What about the man who's been there for every fever, every nightmare, every skin knee? The man who loves him more than life itself? What rights do I have?" Sarah reached for me, but I stepped back, the distance between us now a chasm no words could bridge. In that moment, I saw our entire relationship for what it was, a carefully constructed illusion, a house of cards built on shifting sands of lies. "I think you should stay at your sister's tonight," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "We'll need to figure out everything. But right now, I can't even look at you." As she packed a bag, her movements jerky with suppressed sobs, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at those damning emails. Each one represented a choice she'd made, a moment when she could have chosen truth, but instead chose deception. The weight of these revelations pressed down on me like a physical thing, threatening to crush what remained of my heart. The night after Sarah left, I wandered through our house like a ghost in a life that no longer felt mine. Every photograph on the walls seemed to mock me with its carefully crafted lie. In our son's room, his toys lay scattered exactly where he'd left them, colorful reminders of an innocence I desperately wanted to protect. The stuffed bear I'd bought him when he was born sat in his reading chair, its glass eyes reflecting moonlight with an almost accusatory gleam. Sleep was impossible. I found myself sitting on the floor of his room, surrounded by the evidence of my love for him. Artwork we'd created together pinned to cork boards, height marks penciled on the doorframe, the solar system mobile I'd spent hours assembling hanging above his bed. Each item held memories that now felt like double-edged swords, cutting deeper with every remembered moment of joy. My phone buzzed periodically with messages from Sarah. Pleas for understanding, attempts at explanation, promises to make things right. Each one felt like another betrayal. Her words now suspect currency in a relationship built on counterfeit trust. I left them unanswered, the blue light of notifications fading into darkness like dying stars. Dawn found me in the kitchen, staring at the family photos magnet to our refrigerator. There we were at the zoo, at the beach, at countless birthday parties. Moments I'd thought were pure now revealed as performances in an elaborate deception. My fingers traced the outline of our son's face in each image, his blonde hair a constant reminder of the truth I'd refused to see. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself, though that pain burned like acid in my veins. It was the realization that every future moment with my son would now carry the weight of this knowledge. How could I look into his innocent eyes without seeing Mark Thompson's features looking back at me? How could I continue being the father he deserved while carrying this burden of truth? My mother called mid-morning, her voice thick with concern. "He's asking for you," she said, and those 4 words nearly broke me. "He wants to know when he can come home." I promised to pick him up soon, though the thought of facing him, of maintaining normalcy while my world crumbled, seemed an impossible task. Sarah's sister reached out next, her message a careful blend of sympathy and mediation. Sarah was devastated, truly sorry, wanted to find a way forward. The words rang hollow against the evidence of years of calculated deception. How do you find a way forward when the path behind you is built on lies? In the afternoon, I found myself in our home office again, methodically going through documents I'd never questioned before: birth certificates, medical records, insurance forms. Each paper represented a choice Sarah had made, a moment when truth could have prevailed but didn't. The magnitude of her deception was staggering, a masterwork of manipulation that had fooled not just me, but our entire social circle. The sun was setting when I finally drove to my parents' house to pick up our son. He ran to me with pure joy, his arms wrapping around my neck with complete trust, and I held him close, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo. In that moment, I understood with crushing clarity that love and truth don't always align, that the heart can form bonds that transcend biology. "Where's Mommy?" he asked as we drove home, his small voice curious and uncomplicated. "She's staying with Aunt Linda for a little while," I managed, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. "But she loves you very much." The lies continued, I realized, now with me as their author. How do you explain betrayal to a child who sees the world in simple truths? How do you protect innocence while navigating the complex landscape of adult deception? That night, as I tucked him into bed, his blonde hair splayed across the pillow like a halo, he asked me to tell him a story. "The one about how you and Mommy fell in love," he requested, and my heart shattered anew. I began the familiar tale, editing out the bitter ending that now tainted every memory, wondering how many more stories I would have to revise as we moved forward into this new, uncertain future. Time doesn't heal all wounds, it just teaches you how to carry them. In the months that followed the revelation, I learned to navigate a new reality where trust felt like a foreign language I'd forgotten how to speak. The divorce proceedings moved forward with cold efficiency, reducing years of shared life to legal documents and asset divisions. But the hardest battles weren't fought in courtrooms. They were waged in quiet moments, in the space between heartbeats. Our son became the center of a complex gravitational system, three adults orbiting his innocence with careful distance. The first time I met Mark Thompson face to face, it was in a sterile family court mediator's office. The resemblance hit me like a physical blow. Those familiar blonde curls, the shape of the nose I'd seen every day in my son's face. He seemed uncomfortable, shifting in his chair as we discussed visitation schedules and parental rights. "I never meant for any of this," he said afterward, catching me in the parking lot. "I wanted to tell you years ago, but Sarah," I cut him off with a raised hand. His guilt was not my burden to bear, his explanations not my comfort to provide. Sarah moved into a small apartment across town, close enough for easy transitions during custody exchanges, but far enough to maintain necessary distance. Each handoff became an exercise in controlled emotion. My son's excited chatter about his time with her filling the car ride home, while I swallowed back questions that had no answers I wanted to hear. One evening, as I helped him with homework at the kitchen table, he looked up suddenly with those innocent eyes that could still pierce my heart. "Dad," he said, the word both bomb and blade. "Are you sad because I look like Mark?" The pencil snapped in my hand, but my voice remained steady as I pulled him close. "I'm sad because grown-ups sometimes make mistakes," I told him, choosing words carefully in this minefield of truth and protection. "But I'm happy every single day because you're my son. Nothing will ever change that." The hardest lesson wasn't learning to live with betrayal. It was learning to separate Sarah's actions from our son's right to love both his biological father and the man who had raised him. Each time he returned from time with Mark, I fought back the instinct to question, to compare, to look for signs of preference. Instead, I learned to listen, to support, to be the safe harbor he needed in this storm of adult complications. Sarah tried repeatedly to explain, to justify, to seek some form of forgiveness. "I chose you," she would say during our necessary interactions. "I chose you to be his father because I knew what an amazing dad you would be." But her words rang hollow against the evidence of her deception. The choice had never been hers to make. Yet life has a way of forcing growth through the cracks of broken foundations. Gradually, the raw edges of betrayal began to smooth, not into forgiveness, but into a kind of acceptance. I found strength in the pure love my son showed me, in his unquestioning acceptance of me as his father despite the complicated reality of his parentage. The truth about family, I learned, isn't written in DNA or legal documents. It's built in moments, helping with math homework, cheering at soccer games, holding him through nightmares. It's in the way he still reaches for my hand when crossing the street, the way his face lights up when I pick him up from school, the way he says, "I love you, Dad," without hesitation or doubt. Mark became a presence in our lives, not an enemy, but a complicated addition to our family story. We learned to coordinate schedules, to communicate about our son's needs, to put his well-being above our own discomfort. Sarah and I found a way to co-parent through the wreckage of our marriage, our interactions civil, if never warm. One night, going through old photos while reorganizing the house, I found the first picture ever taken of me holding my son in the hospital. The sight still held power to wound, but now I could see beyond the deception to the truth that mattered most. The love in my eyes as I cradled him, the beginning of a bond that no revelation could break. I sealed that photo in an envelope, along with others documenting our journey together. Someday, when he's older, these images will help tell the complex story of his family. Not a perfect story, but one filled with love, resilience, and the kind of truth that emerges only after everything else has been stripped away. The future stretches before us, uncertain but full of possibility. I've learned that love isn't always enough to hold a marriage together, but it's more than enough to keep a family whole, even when its shape changes. My son may carry another man's DNA, but he carries my heart, my values, my love, and in the end, that's the only truth that matters. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. See you soon.